Well, it's a great joy to be here and great to be in Boise, particularly connected to the Catholic community. Your bishop came from our place. He was a pastor of a church that I was neighboring, and he was also at my university. He actually turned around the seminary we had there in an extraordinary way. You're very blessed to have him. As Keith mentioned, I have two books that I'll be basically just talk on. One on your right is a document that came out of the Vatican that I helped coordinate and put things together on, called The Vocation of the Business Leader. And then this book, Getting Work Right, is really a kind of commentary on that with more examples and case studies and trying to operationalize what's often mentioned in there. So this idea of getting work right. To get at this, obviously I'll talk about ideas, but really key to it is the story of your life and the stories of your lives. If you can't connect us to the stories of your lives, it's not gonna connect, right? And that's gonna be key, because I suspect most of you are here because you got some great stories in your lives. Had great dinner last night talking about farms, right? Talking about backgrounds. Those are phenomenal stories that actually define the way we work. But we also have to be honest that sometimes not all our stories are actually providing good insights. For example, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a blue-collar neighborhood. Both my parents were from Ireland. And I was walking out the door, I was about 16, and my dad was a bit tired of my behaviors at that age. And he looked at me, he says, Michael, you be a good boy, Michael. I said, sure, Dad, whatever, as a teenager would say to his father. Before I could take another step, my father looked at me and says, but Michael, if you can't be good, you be careful. Sure, right? Well, an unfortunate event happened to me that evening. I'll spare you the details, but my father had to pick me up from a Chicago police station. He walks in the police station, he looks at me, and says, Michael, I think you better just be good. Right? Now, I tell that story. My father and I had a lot of wrestling with lots of different things, but we live in a culture that tends to be fixated on being careful. So we have this thing called designated drivers, safe and careful drivers who take home drunk and stupid friends. We have this idea of safe sex, somehow thinking that consent and safety of human sexuality is going to make up for the beauty of the conjugal love of the unitive and procreative dimension. We have an educational system that constantly is harping on grades and scores to get into the next school so as to get the job that you want, and we've lost sight of what a good education's about. And then we have our own careers, that we want to get from this place to that place in order to get to that position there, and we've lost sight of what it means to have good work. And so this whole idea about how we think about things is sometimes easily gets disordered. Now, I suspect most of us would never say that being careful or making money or having fame or whatever it might be is the most important thing in life, but we tend to sometimes act in one way and we speak in another. And this gets at a theme that are in both documents, and it's a theme that has been talked a lot about in the Catholic tradition called the divided life. There's a document called Gaudium et Spes from Second Vatican Council, and it says this. He says, the split between the faith which many profess in their daily lives deserves to be counted among the more serious errors of our age. Let there be no false opposition between professional and social activities on the one hand and religious life on the other. There's lots of reasons for the divided life, but I think sometimes to get at the root of it, you have to go to Scripture. And to go to Scripture, go to the beginnings. Go to the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Because in there, you see how we've been created. And we were just talking about the role of Judaism. If you really want to sometimes get a good sense of the Old Testament, go to the Jews. And there's a man named Joseph Soloveitchik. He's a Jewish rabbi. And he wrote a fascinating book called The Lonely Man of Faith. And he talks about that in the first book of Genesis, you have two creation stories, not one. Right? And he calls the first one Adam 1, and he calls the second one Adam 2. And it's interesting. They're coming at something in a very different way. And he says, if you look at the first creation story, what do you get? You get man the maker. Right? What does God say? Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. right? Who is man? Man is made in the image of God. Who is God? God is a creator, God of abundance. And this whole idea that we are about getting out there. We're about getting a work. A work is to be done. We're on mission. And if we don't have that, there's something that's not quite working in who we are. But then Soloveitchik says, but go to chapter 2 of Genesis, and you get a second creation story. And that creation story is very different. That creation story is about man being formed in the dust from the ground, and he's breathed into, and man is taken and he's placed in the garden, and he's told to till it and take care of it, right? This is man, the receptor. This is man, the receiver. This is man where God is working on him. And it's kind of like breathing. You breathe out, you breathe in, right? You do and you receive. You're giving and receiving. And what Soloveitchik says is these are not two creation stories out there. These are not two personalities. This is who we are as human beings. This is the creation in us. And we live in a culture that has disordered that. It's called the fall. And predominantly in our culture, it's not the only problem. We don't have enough time to get into all the different problems. But Soloveitchik says that the modern world has elevated Adam 1 and has demeaned Adam 2. Right? And so that's one of the things I want to talk about today. On the other hand, we got another problem going on right now. We were talking about that with our own kids. Sometimes we're living in a world where our kids have lost faith in institutions, and they've lost faith that there's a work to be done. And they have now kind of focused simply on this idea of receiving or other types of things. I can get into that in a little bit. But I want to focus really more on this challenge of the divided life as it relates to this challenge where we've elevated our doing over who we've been. And it's interesting, this idea of the divide. We're going to wrestle with that. So in this talk, I want to talk about 3 questions. The first question is, what am I working for? What am I giving myself to the work that I am to do? We work way too much to deprive ourselves of a good answer to this. But here's the paradox. You won't get a good answer to that unless you get to a second question, which is not a question we often ask ourselves, which is, what am I resting in? What am I resting in? Because this rest question is going to have a lot to do with how we understand our work. And then when we can put these 2 questions in a way that they integrate with each other, we get to this third question about what am I living for? So that's the fundamental sense of this talk. And I don't know what it is about academics, but we have to put everything into a matrix. I don't know what it is, right? Now, let me be very clear before I go any farther. You're way too complex to be put into a matrix. I am not trying to explain the world in a 2x3 matrix, okay? Let's just make sure that's clear. But it's more of a pedagogical tool for you to track about where I'm going. And it's a way of just picturing the ideas that I'm going to put forward to it. The second thing that academics like is a thesis. And here's the thesis. If we don't get leisure right, we will not get work right. That's the thesis. Right? And so how do I want to go? What I basically want to do is I want to start here, and I want to basically give 2 views. These are not the only 2 views in the world. It's just a way to start the conversation. And it's all laid out in my book where I talk about other views besides these 2, but these are the 2 I want to highlight. And you can look at it from a secular perspective of work, leisure, and integration, or you can look at it as a Catholic would look at it. So I just want to put these 2, contrast them, and to see the challenges. And again, there'll be other things we'll want to talk about. So first view. Some people look at their work as a career. By the way, in the book, I talk about some people look at their work as a job. It's just about money, right? But actually, I meet particularly, I've taught in business, I work in business. A lot of these business people I meet with don't simply work for money. They actually work because they really love it. They like to work because they get a lot of psychological rewards from it. There's something intrinsic about it. There's a certain degree of self-esteem and creativity and personal satisfaction. There's a guy who wrote a book called Flow, and he talks about the flow or zone when people's talents inside are matched to the problems that they have there. And there's this kind of energy that goes from what's in there to there, and how they've been able to be productive, and how they've been able to solve problems, and how they've been able to utilize certain things that have not been utilized before. Why? We're made that way. That's how we've been made. That's Adam 1. right? And that's why a lot of people like to go to work. That's why you have serial entrepreneurs. There's no way they're going to spend all the money they have. They enjoy work, and there's something about that. But here's the challenge. When you see it as a career, right, it's very interesting. The etymology of the word career, it's the same where we get the word car. It comes from the word carrier, the French carrier, right? And so we often see our work as a career as an automobile, right? I got this self-and-glass little entity, and I get to go wherever I want to go. I got to obey the rules of the road, but I get to go where I want to go. And what happens with the careerists is that they don't really ask any other questions besides their own interest or their own kind of what they want. There's one student, I'm sure you probably have heard this, I'll never forget a student saying, "Hey, Dr. Naughton, you do you, right? It's all about your dreams, it's about your passions, right? It's about your interests, about your desires." So we live in a culture that often fosters this kind of highly individualistic view of things. Now, again, the leader is often not money mad, but they are very goal-oriented. And it's the thrill of the achievement that often drives them and often is how they want to look at things. Now, why do people look at work this way? Why is this such a predominant view, certainly in our culture? Well, one of it has to do with how people look at leisure. And they see leisure purely as a utility, a function, something that gets done for something else. This is endemic in the university, right? Education is simply justified based only on its instrumental value to career, right? So my students, like Dr. Naughton, like what do I got to take theology? Like what is it going to do to me, right? And I say, first of all, get the word "like" out of your vocabulary. Okay, but that's another issue, right? We all have filler. We all do it. I have mine. Fortunately, I have a wife who tells me what that filler is, right? So, but I tell them, I said, did you know that the word education comes from a Latin word of scola, which is where we get the word school from? That education is leisure. You are at leisure. No, I don't think so, Dr. Naughton. I don't think so, right? I mean, this is something that's just simply not it. We have instrumentalized education purely for its instrumental value to the career. And we've done this even for rest itself. Rest is justified to sharpen the saw in order to be more productive. I love Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I think he got the last habit wrong. Right? He often talks about that we rest in order to sharpen the saw. That is true, but that's not the primary reason why you rest. It's very interesting. There's a psychological disease called Sunday neurosis. Why is it that on Sunday, people often feel this kind of dread, a low-grade depression, a kind of angst, a kind of boredom? Why is that happening? Now, some people will say because they have to go back to work on Monday. There's some truth to that, but I actually think it's because people don't know how to rest, and they've gotten themselves in knots, and thus they run into this type of psychological challenge. That is, there are some things you have to do for the right reason. T.S. Eliot has a great line, "To do the right deed for the wrong reason is the greatest treason." If I love my wife because I want to get something out of her, no matter what I do, it could be great things, I have corrupted the love. Leisure is a similar way. It is a very important term. It's not simply about golf, right? There's something in it that's trying to get at the nature of that rest. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that often we have a view of looking at life as simply about our achievements. And this is really what career is about. It's a form of careerism, right? The first question we often ask somebody is, so, what do you do? I do this all the time. Now, sometimes you have to be careful, as the second question is, you want to see my resume? And thus they talk all about their achievements. Because why? Their identity is in their achievements. It's in their title, it's in what they've done. It's not in their relationships. And this is the danger of careerism, that we're so focused on doing that we've lost sight of being. Right? So, a lot more to be said on this, but essentially what you're looking at is a psychological, or I would say a moral and spiritual disease of the culture. It's not the only one, but it is one. And for most of us, we've caught it. I will say I have caught it, right? Anybody in professional life, anybody doing something, It's just often a disease that's easily caught. Right? So if that's one, what's the response? How then should a Catholic begin to look at this question? And so here, it seems to me that the Catholic needs to look at it in terms of not work as a career, but work as a vocation. And one way of thinking about this is that look at your work as a vocation, but make sure that you understand that there's 3 calls going on before, in a sense, particularly 2 before your work. So the first call for all of us is to be human. It's the universal call to holiness, the universal call to love. And this line, this line from Gaudium et Spes, I find it beautiful. A person cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Right? This is universal. No matter where you go, this is universal. Right? This is the universal call. But as Catholics, we often think about the idea that we are called to a state of life, that we belong to a community. And that can be either in the lay, the religious, or the priestly. And by the way, these 3 states of life are like the 3-legged stools of the church. When the 3 are strong, the church is strong. When one weakens, the other starts to wobble. And this is huge. And you always have to be careful of getting in. Yes, priests and religious have a special vocation in that particular area. But we too have been called to a particular kind of life that is crucial. So those 3. And by the way, for us, as far as I can tell, most of us have been called to the lay state here. And many of us have been called to marriage. And this is why I have a colleague of mine who has 12 children. And he once said to me, he says, my wife only has one husband. My kids only have one dad. My students have a lot of teachers, right? There's a primacy of that vocation that can never be subservient to our work. And yet, with all that said, we are still called to work. And we are called to a particular way of working. We're not called to a particular position, but we're called to a way of working. And John Paul, who wrote a beautiful encyclical called Laborem Exercens on human work, says this. He says, work constitutes one of the fundamental dimensions of our earthly existence and of our vocation, precisely because our work allows us to exercise our gifts in serving others. This is at the heart of the nature of work. Work as giving. That there is a logic of gift that ought to animate the way we understand our work, even when that work is debilitating, even when it might be toxic, even when it has problems. You might need to get out of it, but even in there, that's the valley. The fruit can grow in the valley. That's what we call the cross. And thus, John Paul speaks a lot about the cross and its nature of work. But there are principles that should be a part of that. But before I get to the principles, I want to give one little lesson from the Native American community. You remember the story when the Puritans came to this country and they met the Native Americans. We called them Indians, right, at the time. And so when they met each other, often what happens when 2 cultures meet each other, they exchange gifts. And there's a guy, a very interesting anthropologist named Lewis Hyde. He wrote a book called The Gift. And he opens the book with this story. And so when they went away and they came back and saw each other, the Native Americans noticed that the Puritans still had the gift that they gave them. And what did they do? They asked for it back, which is where we get the term Indian givers. That's where that was coming from. Now, anybody's gone to a different culture, you read, I've lived in Italy 5 different semesters. I thought I still think the Italians are a little bit crazy, but I thought they were very rude in certain things, right? You look at certain things and you misinterpret what's going on in the culture. Well, we misinterpreted something. What Native Americans understood is that gifts are meant to be in motion. The gifts that are given to you are not for you. They're meant to go through you to serve others. And when we use our gifts to only serve ourselves, they corrupt us. That's the nature, that's the law of the gift. That's the way gifts work. And in a sense, you can't disobey it. So when we think about our work, the question is, how do I give in my work? And that's what the books and all the things are going. And in that is, what good am I doing? That's what every day. What good am I doing here? What's the good going on? And a lot of us lose sight of it, because why? We often get fixated on one small part of our work, and we lose sight of all the other things that are going on. And in the church, it speaks about the idea of having three goods. When you go into an institution of work, these three goods. And the first one is good goods, meeting the needs of the world by creating goods that are truly good and services that it's truly serving, right? I am the board chair of a manufacturing company. It's a torque technology company, small hinges essentially. And the founder was a very committed Protestant engineer. And I remember our first conversation. He says, I wish we made like pacemakers instead of hinges. And I said, well, that's a nice thing, but what if everyone made pacemakers? We need hinges. We need carpet. We need paint. We need a whole bunch of things to make this society run. Just because you might be in a place where saving lives, that's great. But boy, I tell you, we don't want everybody there. That's what makes a good economy run, is to have lots of different goods operating very well. Second good is the good work, fostering the dignity of work by helping coworkers to develop their gifts and talents. Here's one of the great phrases I heard from an executive one time: being a gift spotter, spotting people's gifts and developing those gifts is one of the great things of a leader in any organization. And thirdly, the idea of good wealth, creating sustainable wealth so that it can be distributed justly. If you don't make more than what's been given to you, you die. That's why profit is critical, right? Profit is a great servant, but by the way, it is a very lousy master. It has its place, but it has to be put in its place. So these three goods are the goods that are about how do I give every day in the work that I do. Now, there's a lot more to be said, and actually maybe my next talk, I'm going to talk more about those goods and the importance of those within an institution. But the idea of these goods present a problem, or let me put it this way, they present a problem for me, because here's what happens to me. I love my work. I get up early every morning, I get going, and I do a lot of things. And a lot of times, though, when I'm working, this little voice comes in my mind and says, well, why am I working harder than everybody else, right? By the way, I even have this in my marriage. Why am I putting in 60% but my wife's putting in 40? I never say that to my wife. I just say it inside here, right? Right. And this idea of the victimization starts to occur. And then that victimization, a certain kind of resentment seeps in. It's subtle, but it's often a sarcastic remark to another colleague about another colleague, right? Just to get the point out there and see whether they're going to take the bait and whether we can have the conversation. And then from that resentment comes a kind of cynicism. Again, it's all subtle. But the problem is that all this good work that I'm doing starts to kind of come in on me. It starts to become almost corrosive. And the question is why? And this gets to the question of leisure. It actually is found in a Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet. You cannot give what you do not have. And if all we do is work, that work will create something corrosive in us. And it's very subtle, and it happens over a long period of time. And that's why leisure is so critical. But it's not leisure as utility, or not leisure as amusement, not leisure as vegging out, but it's leisure as contemplation. Or, as one person put it, it's an act of receivement, of fostering a contemplative outlook to receive the reality of the world. Pope Benedict XVI had a beautiful way of putting it. He says, the person comes to the most profoundest sense of himself, not through what he achieves, but through what he receives. Right? And so what does that receiving mean? Leisure in contemplation is fundamentally an act of reception. What does that look like? Let me give three elements to it. The first is the habit of solitude and of silence. And by the way, not silence out there, but silence in here. I don't know about you, but I got these emotional tapes going on all the time. I am the unappreciated genius at my university. If they would just listen to me, I could solve the problem of identity and mission at this institution, and we can be a much more vibrant Catholic university, blah, 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 right? And so they're not necessarily bad tapes, but they go on. They're monologues. And what they do is they create a false self. They create the false image of who I think I am. And so the question is, when does it stop? John Michael Talbot, he's a singer-songwriter, said, "The wise man seeks the silence that deafens every fool." How does one create the silence? Because once you can stop the tapes, then God can speak to you. And it's often then that when you take the word comes in ways it's never come in. The second habit, and this is actually a third talk that I'll give, is talking about the importance of the Lord's Day. And I think it's so critical to in a sense, reclaiming the Lord's Day is going to be critical. But we were talking about this last night. The Lord's Day is not the Lord's hour. It's the Lord's Day. And we Catholics are in bad habits of getting the Lord's hour in. Yep, got it in. But no, the Lord is asking for a whole day. And one way, and again, this is not easy, but if you could become a techno-Sabbatarian, let go of the technology for a day, or at least a half a day. If you can't do a half a day, at least do it in an hour. And if you can't do it in an hour, you're addicted. It's called internet anxiety disorder. And the first thing every good addict needs to do is confess and face often the addictions they have, right? The Jews are very good at this. They would put away work and consumption, not because they're bad, but because they don't define my identity. And those little devices have defined us in ways that often we are unaware of. And by the way, here's another thesis, and I'll talk about this later in the third talk. I said, if we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. If we don't get Sunday right, we're not going to get Monday right. There is an integral relationship to these things. And thirdly, the habit of fraternity, of going to the margins, of being with those who appears who cannot do anything for us. And we don't go to them to simply do things for them. We go to the poor and the margins and the elderly and those who are lonely, just to be with them. Just to be with them. And in that being, certain things will happen. So these are, I would say, 3 forms of leisure. There's many more, but these are 3 forms that I think are very helpful. It's interesting, by the way, Jesus always got in trouble healing on the Sabbath, being with those in the margins. Right? It's a very interesting line in Jesus. So these 3 habits. Maybe a quick story to kind of highlight the 3 of them. I met Mother Teresa twice in my life. Once was in Chicago, and the other was in Calcutta, India. And when I was in Calcutta, I was giving a talk at an Institute of Management. And my host, who was Hindu, knew I was Catholic, and he says, "You want to go meet Mother Teresa?" I said, "Sure." So we got into a cab, went down to the Mother House, walked in, and there's Mother Teresa. And my Hindu friend drops to his knees, and he's trying to kiss Mother Teresa's feet. And Mother Teresa's trying to pick him up, and he's trying to kiss her feet, and there's this wrestling match going right out in front of me, right? And honest to goodness, I kid you not, the only thought that came to my mind in that moment was, man, she has small feet. God, is she short. And boy, is she old. It was in 1995, 2 years before she died, right? And I was like, can't you think of something more profound, right? I mean, I'm sitting in the front of the icon of holiness, and I'm thinking about feet and age. But anyhow, so we had about a 20-minute conversation. And one of the interesting things, she talked about her experience in China. And when she passed and when her canonization process, I read an article about her, and someone said, "Why are you so interested in getting into China?" And I love this line. She says, "My great desire is to meet anybody who has nobody." I often think about, what if I had that attitude when I walked into a party or walked into a meeting, right? I'm not looking for the nobody, I'm looking for the somebody, right? I want to talk to the interesting people. That's that kind of, it's a different standard that they have that we often have to kind of understand. So after the conversation, as we're leaving, Mother Teresa looks at us and she goes, "I'd like to give you my business card." Right? Seriously, that was exactly her line. And she gave this little card, and this card is sitting on my desk right now with her signature. She signed it as well. And it says this: "The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace." It starts in silence. It starts in the receptivity. It's not starting with my agenda, but in sense of what does God want of me in this area. So this business card, it seems to me, is at the heart of this idea of integrity, of the integration of the active life of work, of which many of us all have to go to, and also the contemplative life. This has been a major theme in the Catholic tradition, the integration of the active and the contemplative life. This word integrity is a fascinating word. It comes from the word integritas, the Latin word, which means integer, to integrate, to make whole, a whole number, the integer. And the source of this integrity, and this is in many respects the heart of the talk, the source of this is not some vague value, some recent slogan, or an ethic or a theory. At the heart of it is a concrete relationship with Christ. For he is the only one who can provide that integration. I can't. That's what makes me fallen. And in this icon is actually right outside our chapel in the center that I run. And it took me a long time to have this word, but it's interesting. The person who wrote the icon, the quote is from Matthew 11:29. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am humble of heart. I don't know about you, but my problem is that I think everything's my work. It's his work. It's our work. But no, and my wife reminds me this all the time, the burdens of the world is often because it's my work. And that is not going to provide the integrity. That's just going to provide Michael Naughton to become highly exhausted. But once I can see it's his work and take on his yoke, then we could do it together. It's very interesting. That scripture line, right before it, is my favorite line in Scripture. Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome, and I will give you rest. So it's his work and it's his rest. That's the source of the integrity. That's the source that is able to overcome our own dysfunctions as we often go through this. This is why I would say that the key way of thinking about it is that we are called to be contemplative practitioners. Right? Those who, we have a great work to be done. By the way, this talk is not to say stop and smell the roses and don't worry about work. That's not the point of the talk. We are called to work hard. We're called to have great resolve, even when it's difficult, even when the obstacles are coming in. That's what Christ is calling us to do. So that's key. But we are also called to great humility, that I can't do it, that my yoke is not it, that I can't give myself rest. Very interesting, by the way, some of you may know this, but this was actually articulated by a guy named Jim Collins, who wrote a book called Good to Great, and he wrote it in an article in the Harvard Business Review, and he says, the two great qualities of a leader, resolve and humility. And by the way, here's the other thing about, and Collins doesn't bring out anything Christian. I don't know if he is Christian or not, but in the humility thing, he says humility doesn't come from your work, it comes from your non-work. It comes from your family. It comes from the crisis that you've encountered, a sickness that you've dealt with, your faith. It talks all about these things, right? That's where it comes from. That's why leisure is so important. So let me wrap up. First, pedagogical tool. It's not going to explain all of reality. It's going to fall apart if we try to make it that way, right? So somewhat simplistic. And many of us are all over the map. For some of us, we may get the leisure thing right, but we're still looking at our work as a job or a career. That's just part of the divided life. Second point, there's nothing wrong with work as a career. When you get promoted because someone's looking at you saying you're doing great work, man, that feels good. That feels good. And when you get extra pay to go along with that, it even feels better. But those are too small for the human spirit. St. Augustine has this great line in the Confessions. He says, the house of my soul is too small for you to come into it. May it be enlarged by you. That is, we walk around with very small views of work and leisure, right? The Lord is asking us for a much larger view, and then he can operate, and great things can happen. And third, that word integrity. It's a tough word, but it's a word that's used quite a bit. And I think the challenge for us is that many of us kind of catch the way people look at it. I work with a lot of business people, a lot of great people, but I must say sometimes a lot of superficial people. And I'll have a lot of business people say, I have integrity. They say it in such a way that they possess it like a car or a house, right? That is, they parrot the kind of trite statements of the culture that says, I do what I say and I say what I do. And it's about as deep as a puddle, to be quite frank with you, right? We're looking at something much deeper here. Because a lot of times, often what we'll do is that we'll reduce things. And to be quite frank, it's often riddled with pride. That's often what's coming out with a lot of this, just a lot of pride. And so in this idea of integrity, integrity is not balance. This is the overused word in the modern world, and it has a role, but balance often perpetuates the divided life, right? It doesn't bring it together into a deeper synthesis. And so that, I think, is the critical thing. And so the thesis of the talk, if we don't get work right, if we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. If we don't get Sunday right, we won't get Monday right. And this, maybe at the heart of the point, is this. There's a man named, and it was very influential on my ideas, because his name is Joseph Pieper. He wrote a book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And Pieper said that leisure is an attitude of the mind, the condition of the soul, to receive the reality of the world, right? This is at the heart of leisure, and at that heart, found through keeping Sunday, the Lord's Day, to pray every day, to read the scriptures, all that is going to help us to understand that deep receptivity, and that will have great influence on the kind of work that we do. So, thank you very much.